Okay, we're at the sewing machine. We have our quilt aligned so that the raw edge of the quilt is to the right of the foot. I did put a quick pin in my binding just so I would know where to start my binding and keep that in the one spot. But I'm going to pop down, remember, about 8 inches from the top edge of my binding, and that's where I'm going to start. So you remember that these squares for this size quilt are 4.5 inch, finishing at 4-inch squares. So I just popped down 2 squares for the cover quilt. If you're working on the cover quilt, those are 3, finishing at 3-inch squares. So what I want to do is I want to sew down this edge, keeping the raw edges. There's 2 of them, remember, because our fabric for our binding is folded in half. And those raw edges we want to keep perfectly aligned with the raw edges of the quilt, and we want to sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I always backstitch at this space anytime other than piecing a quilt block. I'm going to backstitch pretty much any other time, and I'm going to backstitch on the edge of a quilt block too. So just go slow. If you are experiencing any puckers or pulling, see if your machine has a dial or a way to lift your presser foot up a tiny bit, because the pressure of the presser foot may be too much. And worst case, you can do some pins for your binding, attaching it to your quilt, and pins may help a little bit too, because they'll keep things a little bit stretched. Just don't forget to take them out when you come to them so you're not harming your machine at all. And remember, this is the front of your sewing your quilt, so you want that 1/4 inch seam allowance to stay as even as possible and a nice smooth straight line, because this is the binding you're going to see on the front of your quilt, and that seam allowance gives you like a really nice clean line. So keep it as straight as possible, go slow, take your time. So when you're getting close to a corner, so here's the corner of our quilt, we want to stop sewing and do a back stitch a 1/4 inch away from the edge. So there's a couple ways you can do that. You can measure a 1/4 inch and have your pins stick out from the edge of your quilt back a little bit, and then just keep your binding on top, and when you get to the point where your needle is coming down at the same spot where your pin is coming out, then you can do a back stitch and then cut your thread there, or you can topically measure as well. Sorry, I did a little camera bump there, so I know that you may have shifted. And once you get used to what a 1/4 inch looks like, you can eyeball it. But right now I would start with measuring a 1/4 inch on your quilt from the bottom edge here and putting a pin coming out, and that will help you. And when you get close to that pin, just go slow. And once the needle going up and down is at the same level as where the pin is coming out, is when you take the pin, stop, back stitch from there, and don't go past that spot. And then I'm going to cut my thread and lift my foot, and we have our stitches end very nicely at about a 1/4 inch away from this bottom edge here. So now we're going to rotate our quilt to the next side. So now we're going to rotate our quilt to the next side. And we need to do a little fold for that binding. So we get the edge of the binding, the raw edge, to continue down the raw edge of our quilt. But we need to have a nice folded corner here. So we want that kind of to do a really nice 90-degree angle, 90-degree fold, I guess, in the corner, and have this raw edge continue down. And in order to do that, this fold that's happening here, we want that to align with the top edge. Does that make sense? So we have our binding coming down straight. We have the top folded edge of our binding aligning along the top of the last edge. And you can see as I fold it down, it does the same thing over here. It aligns with that edge, and we have kind of this little like angled fold of this excess fabric. It takes a little practice, and it's fine if you don't get it perfect the first time. What we're now going to do is we want to start stitching a 1/4 inch away from this edge and a 1/4 inch down from the top. Essentially, where our stitches ended here, we want to start our stitches right there on the other side of that fold. And you can do that by placing a pin in there, by measuring. I am just going to eyeball it because I've done this hundreds of times. You do want to back stitch, but you want to come forward first and then back stitch to that point and then come forward. We don't want to go behind that point at all. I'll show you that fold once we get going a little bit so I can angle it in front of the camera, how it looks now that it's going to be stitched. And we're going to continue stitching down this side, doing the same thing as last time, aligning our edges. This is that little treble area that I unpicked some stitches. I'm just going to stretch it out so that fabric that's wavy right now is smooth, and then I'm going to pull the binding down to meet the smoothness. Sew across it, and then I can let go of the stretch, and it's going to be perfect. We'll show you that too in a minute. You're going to have to keep track of your quilt. It's big and cumbersome, so it doesn't drag or pull, and that won't help your binding at all. I also wanted to move my little binding cake up here. I just wound it around my fingers. If you have a binding spool, that's awesome to use as well. But as I'm using, I have a little bit of a tail hanging off. I'll just kind of turn and unwind a little bit more, and that's how I can kind of keep it organized. I'm actually coming up to the next seam of my binding, which you don't have to do anything about, but it's just nice to know it's not going to hit in a corner again. Unwinding a little bit more of my binding. I have literally had my binding in a pile on the floor next to me as well, and that is fine. Sometimes it can get tangled or stuck under the leg of your chair, but mostly it's fine. So whatever works for you. So before we get to this corner, let's take a look at our last corner. So we have this spot where we stretched a little bit so that that blue would stretch across, and you can see now it's a nice smooth piece of fabric, no major ripples. Then you see here our starting point for our binding, and we have this kind of angled flap, and that's our start ending point for that binding edge. And this flap can go back and forth to either side so that when we open it up and we push our binding to the back, we're going to make a magical little bias crease right there. That's going to work out perfectly. That is our goal. A little angled fold to finish off the look of that binding, because we're going to angle this and pull it to the back, and we're going to pull the other side to the back, and that is what our binding is going to look like. So let's do that corner again at the next corner. Remember, we want to measure a 1/4 inch in from the edge and put our pin there, and that's on the quilt. And then we are going to sew until our needle is just about at the pin or is right on top of the pin, and then we're going to do a back stitch. And then we'll come forward, and we want to stop at the corner of where that pin is and cut our thread, because we don't want to go past where that 1/4 inch mark is into the corner. Rotate your quilt again. It gets a little bit harder when you're starting a new corner because all the weight of the quilt is on your lap. So now we're going to do that fold again. We're going to bring this edge to a 90-degree fold, aligning those raw edges of your binding with the raw edges of your quilt and straightening up this edge here to get a really nice fold. Either way, it'll come straight down and we have that nice kind of flap, and we're going to start sewing on this side of the fold where we ended on the other side. A 1/4 inch from the edge, a 1/4 inch down from the top. There's like a little bump kind of where the fabric underneath is thicker because we've got extra fabric there. And that's kind of what I use as a guide for my needle, knowing where to start and stop. Or you can definitely measure. So you have to do that corner fold 4 times. One in each corner. So you have time to practice, which is good. And Now, as we're coming to our last corner, I wanted to just talk to you about why we do a 1/4 of an inch sewing on top of the quilt on the front side of the quilt. And that's because, like this quilt with our squares, we need to finish off that square so it's the same size. If you did 3/8 of an inch, all the squares around the corner, around the edges of the quilt are going to look different size than the rest of the squares. So that's one of the reasons we have to pay attention to our trimming as well. If we were to trim off too much, those squares would look odd. So if I'm doing a wider binding for something, it's only wide on the back. It's still a 1/4 of an inch on the front. And if I really wanted the look of a wide binding on the front, I would only do that on a quilt that has like a single fabric border or a sashing. These quilts have pieces on the edges that if you cut too small will look different size than the rest. Not all quilt blocks are like that, so you could potentially trim down other quilt edges if the quilt blocks have kind of like a sashed border or something. Okay, so we are getting to the end of our quilt where we started, and we have this 8 inches that we started with, and we need to connect somewhere in this realm of fabric. So we want to leave kind of an 8-inch tail on the next side so that when we get to this point, we're not super close working in these areas. So I'm going to stop 2 squares away and just do a quick back stitch. So we have to connect these 2 ends, right? We have, let's back up a touch here. We have the end coming off where we started. This is where it's sewn down here by my finger at the bottom, and it is coming across the top. And we have this piece that is sewn up here and coming down. So we need to continue sewing those onto the quilt, but we need to make a continuous piece of binding first. So what I like to do, because I do straight binding, is I literally like to stretch those pieces of binding from where they're sewn on across the rest of this quilt top. And I am, where they meet here, we kind of want to angle them up so I can fold them and butt the folds right up next to each other. And then I'm going to cut off from that where they butt up next to each other. I'm going to cut off a 1/4 of an inch. You can kind of also pull them together and have them align and come up vertically from the edge of the quilt. And then I just kind of pull them and trim them so that I can sew across where they butt up next to each other. So that's a straight seam. If you want to do an angled seam, if you're doing the bias. So we want to cut off a little piece from the end of the binding so we can use it to measure. And then from where we started the binding on the quilt, we're going to smooth it out straight up the side of the quilt. And where we ended on the binding, we're going to smooth that down so we're overlapping the 2 pieces of binding. And then we're going to take that piece that we cut off, and that shares with us the width of the binding. And we're going to line that with the top edge of the binding coming up from the bottom. And then we're going to cut the binding coming down from the top layer of binding at the bottom edge of that measure piece. And that's going to give us a perfect 2.5-inch overlap, which is going to help us get the perfect bias binding. So now we need to align our pieces that we have, just like I showed you in the previous video with trimming and making our binding. we are going to combine these binding pieces the same way. So we have the top one coming off to the side in a horizontal format, and the bottom one is coming up underneath that in a vertical format. And then we're going to pin those together with the corners aligned. We're going to mark our diagonal line from that top corner down to the bottom corner. And then once it's marked, you're going to sew directly on top of that line. And then once it's sewn, you can backstitch at the beginning and end of this seam. You also don't really have to backstitch. Trim off that extra tail, but first it's always good to check if that, once that fabric is folded back over, that it aligns, that everything lines up, the raw edges line up with the quilt, and that it's the proper length. Then you can trim off that little tail and press that seam open. You can finger press that seam. You don't have to iron it with an iron if you don't want to get up from your machine. Finger pressing works fine. And then you're going to backstitch where you ended your stitches attaching your binding previously, and stitch the edge of that binding all the way down, backstitching on top of where you started your binding at the beginning of the quilt, trying to align those stitches as you're starting and stopping perfectly with the stitches that come before it, so that your binding is a nice clean edge on the front. So that is how you finish off the binding for your quilt to make a continuous loop. You can do the bias seam if you've done the rest of your seams in that bias angled seam, or you can do the straight seam, which is very simple and what I typically use. And then we're going to go and iron our fabric to the back of our quilt so we can machine stitch our binding down. So let's hop over and do some ironing. So we have another quilt prepped for binding, and I machine stitched the binding down, and we're going to machine stitch the binding on the other side as well. So you're going to do the same thing for this quilt that we talked about before, ironing all of these edges flat. And once you have all of the edges ironed flat on the front, you're going to flip it over, and we want to iron those edges folded over to the back. And the reason that this is really good for ironing for machine binding is machine binding, we need everything, ooh, it was a little hot, to be folded over how it's going to be sewn. But where with hand binding, we would stitch down on the back, with machine binding, we have to stitch it from the front. So we want to fold it over and have it really nice and straight. Then we're going to stitch from the front. We're going to stitch as close to the edge of the binding as possible. It's called stitching in the ditch. And that will put our stitches somewhere in from the edge of the binding, just a little bit. But we need to have our binding as smooth and pulled into place as possible, so that we're sure to catch all of those edges on the back, because it would be the worst if we sewed around the whole quilt thinking we caught all of the backing when we're doing the stitch in the ditch on the front, only to have some of that backing not caught. So you just want to work your way all around your quilt, folding it over to the back, making sure that you are plenty over the stitch line. You can see your stitch line from where you stitch the binding onto the front, and as long as that's fully covered, you should be fine with stitching on the front and catching the whole back. And we're going to do the corners just like we did the corners for hand sewing. Let's go back to this corner up here. So let's do this side, getting it ironed over. And it is a little tricky sometimes because, you know, if our seam allowance wasn't quite perfect when stitching it on the front, it can cause some problems coming around to the back and pulling it all the way over. So that's another just good point, is to make sure your seam allowance on the front is really good. And I'm placing my clips as close together as I need to feel comfortable. So when we get to the corner, remember how on the hand stitching video I ironed it one way and then I switched it? Well, we're going to do it the right way this time. I like to come in from this direction on this side because that's how I hand stitch, and then fold it over. And you can do a clover clip. Often on these I will do a pin so I keep that perfectly aligned, because we do have to come with our needle and then pivot at this point. So having a pin in there instead of a clover clip on the corner can really help. So that's how we do a corner again. Pretty easy. So I'm gonna go around and get the rest of this prepped, and then we'll meet you at the machine. So we have our binding prepped for machine stitching. It is ironed over to the back, and we have clover clips in place. Now you might have a foot for your machine that's like a stitch in the ditch foot. And that would have a little guide that would help you stay right in this ditch. Otherwise, just keeping your needle perfectly on the edge of that binding, but not on the binding. It's only going through the backing, just to the side of the binding. And I suggest going slow here and trying to feel so that you can make sure that you're hitting the back of your binding. And then a little bit bigger stitch length is good. And I do like to back stitch at the beginning and end. Take your clover clips out, and I'd say just double check as you take your clover clips out that your binding on the back is fully covering all the stitches, and just stitch along, trying to always have your needle end in the down position as you come to a stop. If any threads stick out on the back of your binding, just tuck them under the edge of the binding and continue along the way. So this is faster than hand binding the second portion of your binding, but you do have to be really good and accurate at making sure everything is folded and ironed properly so that you catch the fabric on the back of your quilt, because if you don't, you do have to go back and unpick some sections, smooth it out, and restitch. And that's fine, but it is nice to get it in one fell swoop so that you don't have any extra threads or back stitching areas. So we're coming up to a corner here, and I have this pinned, so I'm going to be careful, but I want to keep that pin in as long as possible. And our goal is here for our needle to go down right in the ditch of that binding, and then lift up our foot, rotate our quilt, and start sewing coming up this side. Again, as close to the edge of the binding here as we can get so that we're catching it on the back. And you can see from the stitch to the edge, there is a decent amount. So that is a good indication of it's going to catch nicely at this corner. But you can see kind of how we pivoted, and it pivots right on the edge of our mitered corner. So that's really good. So I'm going to speed up for the rest of the sewing until I get close to the end, so you can hang out and listen to the music and watch me bind, or you can skip a couple of minutes towards the end to finish off this video. I am coming up to the beginning of the binding where I started. So there's really nothing different that you have to do. The only thing that I would recommend is trying to stop your stitches directly on top of the stitches that you started with, and then doing a back stitch so that you have that line going continuously in the direction that you need it to go. So there we have our stitching, which turned out pretty decent. Any stray threads that are popping out from the back of your binding, from the raw edges, just clip them, or if you can pull them right out. But clipping them won't hurt anything, so just keep that in mind. And no matter what you do, hand binding or machine binding, just practice. You'll get better and better at it the more you do it.